Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you were able to participate in at least one of the breakouts, if not more, and that you had some useful discussions. We're going to ping the chairs of the respective sessions over the next hour and a half or so, and discuss some of the themes that came out, and try to capture a little bit of a sense of the discussion. As Andy mentioned this morning, so the 5 breakouts that we're coming back from included research and development, commercialization, physical and cyber infrastructure, education, and workforce development, and responsible development. And the moderators for these sessions, respectively, were Kristen, Landon, Jennifer, Jared, and Gretchen. And what we're going to do now is not have a just report out of what happened from each of the moderators, but actually to have a discussion. So it's a little bit different than we normally do. But to kick things off, and before we get into some of the themes, I wanted to ask each of you, kind of as a gut reaction, what was maybe the most surprising thing or theme or topic that you talked about that maybe coming in you hadn't considered? So I'm going to go in that order. So Kristen, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Lisa. Surprising, I'm not sure. They were, I think there were a lot of comments that that resonated with people, that we all felt like, okay, this is something that we all can get on board with. Maybe I'll mention a few. One thing when we were talking about the workforce development is that we kind of converged on this, that it's really important to teach students fundamentals, whereas the academic model today about how we tend to recruit assistant professors is normally around topics that are very hot, so that we know that they can attract funding, so they can sponsor their research groups. That doesn't necessarily speak to teaching the fundamentals in core areas that you need to know in material science or in some other nanotechnology relevant arena. And that was across the board when we discussed that we, from industry to academia, it's really important to teach fundamentals. You can sprinkle it with modern day examples, but that is more important than teaching them very, very specific, because that tends to age. And it's also something that industry wants to teach these students themselves when they come out. They need them to know the fundamentals. They can't give them that, but they can give them specifics in their specific area. So something to think about, and how we incentivize academic institutions to hire people that can teach those fundamentals while still going after specific grants or research directions. Or maybe we should just streamline and have a few institutions give classes to 5,000 students. If you have a really good class of fundamental corrosion science somewhere in the world, which is really hard to hire people that do corrosion these days, because it's not that much of funding in fundamental corrosion anymore. You have to cast it as electrochemistry, and maybe then you're better off. Is there a way we can leverage these resources, especially now with the more online and hybrid models of education that we've all been exploring during COVID, in a better way going forward? Why do we have to teach the same class everywhere if it's done really well at a few different institutions?
So thank you. That was really great. I appreciate that. And actually, I taught corrosion at Lehigh and UVA when I was, back in my academic days. So I'm glad to hear that remains a useful area. I'm going to move on, and again, these are going to be our gut reactions, and then I'm certainly going to come back to that after we finish with Jared. So Landon, in your session, what did you hear that maybe was unexpected or different than you expected?
So the one thing to me that was absolutely interesting is, I've had this feeling for quite some time that, you have a startup in nanomaterials focused on an application where you have a really strong research bench. And that, in my experience, those firms attempt to then go the full distance of the scale up, the commercialization, the legal, the regulatory, everything else. And typically most people are silent on this, but our particular group was very quick to say, look, you do not need to do all that or bring in the competency from outside because it's so resource intensive. This is something that I agree with fundamentally, but I'm not necessarily heard from a panel before. So I thought that was interesting, to say the least. A couple other key takeaways. One of the primary questions that we were asked to solve is, technical areas of national significance that, if it was given a push, could be commercialized. I think not unsurprisingly, people didn't have a lot of views into this area. And I think that's just because of the nature of nano in general. It's so cross-cutting. One very active portion of our conversation was around capital and how that is a persistent challenge. This is not anything new. But we did have a number of really good discussions about potential roles that the government could play, or pathways in which it could get involved and how it might get involved. And another thing that, I thought was nice to see the recognition, not something that I would typically see, is, how startups, early stage businesses, because they're usually founded on a technical concept, don't really have the business expertise or acumen in-house. And we did have a really good and strong conversation around, okay, how do we help those founders either build up a certain amount of business acumen and capacity, and or how to help them transition the organization so that you have investable management, as one person put it, to grow the business after invention has occurred. So those were the key takeaways from our end.
Great, thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, so we had a great discussion on infrastructure, talking both about cyber infrastructure and physical infrastructure, and kind of, key takeaways, and also in some ways kind of surprising discussion centered around, first of all, like, how can we, as universities or commercial entities or as a nation, kind of most effectively pivot into high impact areas with infrastructure? And, as examples, I think COVID is an extremely important one, right? Like, how can the R&D community most effectively research into or pivot into research into COVID, or, for example, into quantum, where you need new infrastructure and potentially, beyond silicon nanofabrication facilities. So how to pivot. Another topic was, how best to translate. So to enable, infrastructure and shared resources that, maybe aren't necessarily like state of the art, but allow you to do kind of scalable, not quite manufacturing, but see like, okay, if you can create one transistor, can create thousands of transistors in order to enable, bridging that gap between research and commercialization. And then the third topic, and the final one I'll mention here, is, how best to be like sustainable in supporting facilities. Like, this infrastructure is so critically needed to enable the next, breakthrough in science. How can we, best sustain and update and maintain these facilities and staffing to, not only improve like the research that we can enable, but also, workforce development and education of our students. And that might include, for example, more systematically, having different funding bodies or funding agencies, work together, rather than siloing themselves, and also work more closely with universities to invest in this infrastructure.
Great, thank you. So Jared, what did you hear that was unexpected?
Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this panel. As part of the education and workforce is what we talked about. I think that the really unexpected thing that I saw wasn't necessarily what we talked about, but really the makeup of who came to our session. I've been talking to industry, so I'm the new center director for the Micro Nanotechnology Education Center, which is an advanced technological education center that really aims to how do we get students certificates so that they can enter the micro nanotech workforce right out of community college. Industry keeps telling me like how important this is. We had one industry person that was in our session and 20 educators. We had maybe 2 or 3 community college faculty, and we ended up having 17 university faculty. So kind of my takeaway and like what unexpected and my thoughts were, how can we encourage industry to participate in breakout sessions on education, in workforce development? How can we promote talking to community colleges. How can we get community college educators to come and participate in these sessions? Because it's just frustrating, because it's like, we're told that this is a really, really essential component of it, but then at the end, whenever there's an opportunity to participate in the discussion, industry is going to choose the R&D or the commercialization or things that I'm not going to minimize. Those are really, really important. But whenever we have educators there talking all by ourselves and there's no industry input, which honestly, that's the most essential part of the entire micro nanotechnology education center is industry input. If we don't have industry input, we are going to fail as a center. We have to get it. And so how do we encourage industry to engage with us and to choose us in a environment like this when there's other options that, to be honest, might be more interesting to them? So I think that was the takeaway that I kind of got from it. And you know, the one invitation that I am going to send to industry is please contact us. We want to work with you. We want you to come and tell us, like, hey, this is what we need. A lot of our educators in community colleges, you know, we teach mostly, and we're not as aware of what's going on industrial-wise. You know, like some of the leadership in my center is, but as a whole, no. So having your input is vital for the success of what we're doing. So my encouragement is, you know, if it's not in this kind of session, contact us and we could get meetings together so that we could figure out a way that you are in the room with us, trying to figure out how can we involve community college education so that we can get those technicians trained and to you so that you can have that resource.
So I think that's an important point for us too. And I think that the nature of this type of workshop, having only one set of breakouts, or one session of breakouts where largely my intention was to visit all of them, and then I got into the conversation and stayed in a single one. And I will go back and watch and listen to the other discussions, but it is a challenge, and I think that that's a takeaway for us to better facilitate the intersection of these discussions. And I think that this is also going to be true for Gretchen's topic. These cross-cutting topics, I think, really relate. And this is the challenge we have as we develop the framework of the NNI. All of these things intersect, and we need to find a way to do that effectively. But Gretchen, what did you hear during your session?
So one surprising thing was there was a comment that that we hoped that the education session was talking about nano EHS as much as nano EHS was talking about education, because we kind of kept circling back to education in our session. I mean, specifically, we, you know, kind of started at the beginning with talking about how ethical and social and legal issues are so important and how they need to be considered in nano EHS research, especially towards the beginning, not at the end. And I think at the end, there was a panelist that really also kind of summarized things pretty eloquently, saying that we needed a translator. So we needed some sort of a way to communicate these complicated nano EHS results in a way that's understandable to all of the stakeholders. And so I think that's a quick summary of some things that are surprising and some of the key ideas.
So great. And I'm actually going to come back to that theme in this, the fact that education was brought up in all of the other sessions is also telling. But I've got a couple of questions that I want to run through, and then I'm going to come back to some of these threads that you all started, and also I believe we are taking questions, and we'll be able to take those as we can. I am interested in kind of getting into the meat of what was discussed in your session, since I only attended one. I'm gonna start with the concept of mechanisms, and Kristen, I'm gonna start with you. We know that we need to fund a mix of single investigator, multi-investigator, multidisciplinary research teams, centers, networks to support the ecosystem, the R&D ecosystem that makes up the NNI. Did any new ideas regarding specific mechanisms to support the community particularly strike you in your discussions? Were there any new ideas we should consider?
Well, I'm not sure they're entirely new. Some of them I think might be things we were well aware of, but maybe it's worth noting it again. The first question you had, I think what I got from my community was that they appreciate all the funding mechanisms that are out there, from single investigators to teams, to smaller teams, larger teams, industry, academia, collaborations, SBIRs, STTRs. They think they're all important in different ways. For example, large hubs might be very important for giving students and young investigators a broad insight into what's going on, a broad education, whereas smaller teams are more sort of focused on a particular problem. We need them both. In terms of academic industry or academia industry partnerships and collaborations, and this is not surprising, it's the need for making things move faster. So more templates and CRADAs available, and maybe more flexibility from federal agencies on how to deal with IP, or how to at least get the negotiations going not from ground zero every single time. I think a lot of us who were in the discussion have been in these conversations, and it can take 9 months to a year to get an industry academic partnership going just because of the legal issues. And it always seems that they start from zero, whereas there must be tons of existing relationships already established that have gone through all that pain. So can't we start from those and try to amend them instead? There was also mentioning of the fact that a lot of our rules, our federal and even sort of UC rules and stuff are stuck in older versions. I know that in the UC system, you have to declare everything that's over $50 that you get from somewhere, because I think that law was made 20, 30 years ago, or maybe $50 was more. Similarly, everything that's bought with DOE and federal money has to get tracked. Maybe there should be a ceiling, or something below that we don't care. Pens, buy them and use them. iPads maybe too, they're quite cheap these days, but maybe computer and bigger equipment. So there's a certain need of modernization of rules and regulations that could help us to get faster, especially when it comes to industry. Typically, if you come back a year later, it's yeah, I'm ready to start. Yeah, sorry, we moved on.
Great, thank you. So Landon, the Academy's report in the review of the NNI focused a lot of its attention on the NNI to better support commercialization. And the U.S. government has a suite of activities from, small business innovative research grants, the I-Corps program, which does some coaching. I know we talked about that a little bit during the session today, through big BAAs. Did any, new mechanisms emerge from the discussions with respect to how the U.S. government can better facilitate commercialization?
Yeah, where our conversation naturally gravitated towards is kind of the arc of investment capital, some of their expectations. So typically with a firm that's just starting out, investor money pours in, and it is there really to fund the research. And because of the nature of research, it takes usually more time, more capital than anybody estimates. So by the time you get to that critical stage of scale up commercialization, there is less capital available, or your investors are risk adverse. And this has been a persistent challenge, no surprise to anybody in material sciences or hard tech for a number of years. Specific mechanisms, what we covered, at a high level was really the need to offset risk of the investor in order to incentivize them to step in, whether that's through, we talked about, low interest loans, perhaps grants, matching funds, things of that nature. Giving no regard to whether the government can actually do those things or not. But that is where I think everybody pretty much has been focused, because investors require an exit horizon of maybe 5 to 7 years, and anybody that's been in the material science business, forget nano, just any material science, we all know that the timelines go significantly beyond that in most cases. But the upside value, of course, is not dissimilar to pharma. Once you get a material into the market, it is sticky and is there for a long time and generates very durable returns. So how do you bridge that gap and really defray risk of investors that otherwise aren't willing to take it?
Great, thank you. So Jennifer, even at the very inception of the NNI, the critical need for infrastructure was a key issue. I mean, this was one of the driving forces that the nano community needs infrastructure. It's expensive. It's hard to do for every individual university. And, 20 years later, that is still the case. I mean, this is really critical, both the cyber and the instrumentation, the physical infrastructure. I know you talked a little bit in your opening remarks about, being able to pivot, being able to better address translational work, and the challenge of sustaining these facilities. But I'm wondering if there were any takeaways that you had from the discussions regarding, the mechanisms to support the community with instrumentation. We do have these networks. I'm just wondering how the conversations around that issue went.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the conversation in the breakout definitely highlighted just the impact that infrastructure like nano hubs or the nano hub or the DOE NSRCs or the NNCI have had on kind of accelerating, science in the United States. I think in terms of refreshing the tools, that was an area that came up a lot. I think with like NNCI and NSRCs and even with cyber infrastructure, in many cases, the U.S. was kind of an early investor in this area, but we're at a point now where we need to figure out how to refresh those tools. And in a lot of cases, the tools are not necessarily, the fanciest tools that might win, for example, an NSF proposal or a DURT proposal. So in the breakout, we kind of concentrated on what are key areas where we think, maybe the U.S. is not as competitive in science, and, how might we kind of better coordinate efforts among all of these centers to see how we can update them, in key areas where we want to play a leading role.
Great. Well, I look forward to the details of that discussion. That sounds like a very important discussion for our future planning. Jared, I've attended some of your center's webinars exploring many of the efforts to support nano education. So I know this is really a topic that's dear to you, and looking how other, how different groups are addressing this. Did any new or different ideas with respect to the mechanisms to support education and workforce development emerge from your discussions?
I do think that we did have some discussions on how do we reach students to make them more aware of what opportunities are available. How can we increase participation of the industry? One suggestion that wasn't mentioned in there is maybe getting the industry to be a part of the business industry leadership team for the Micro Nanotechnology Education Center. And instead of having an advisory board model, have a built model. And a built model is basically the idea that industry is going to be actively engaged and actively looking at curriculum and looking at what we're teaching in order to give us advice on, oh, you know what, here's the important knowledge, skills, and attributes that are needed for micro nanotechnology coming in the next 5 or 10 years. Because I think one of the important parts in this mechanism is we don't want to be teaching the students what's happening now. We want to work with industry and talk to them about, well, what's coming in 5 years or what's coming in 10 years? How are we developing our programs at this moment so that we are meeting the needs of industry for the future? So I think that those are sort of the discussions that we're having within the MinTech and within the breakout session that we did have.
Great, thank you. And Gretchen, the USEU communities of research have been one model that people have pointed to with respect to communication, and we'll get to that topic next, but also as a way for researchers to collaborate and a mechanism to support that community. I was wondering if that was discussed or if any other mechanisms were identified where we can better support the responsible development community.
We did talk about communication specifically. There was a discussion point related to infrastructure. So kind of the need to be able to share data and to share data in a way that is secure and possibly anonymous, and also be able to make sure that that data is still going to be able to be published for the academics. And let me see, let me look to my notes. I think that was the most of that part. There was a little bit of discussion about trying to get access to nanomaterials that are kind of already out, that are that consumers are being exposed to, and not always being able to access those materials from industry. And I think did I answer all of your questions?
Yeah, that's okay. Unless if you have something additional to add, I think that's fine too.
Okay, I think that about covers it.
Okay, great. So yesterday I was struck by, and I'm kind of moving on to the big theme of communication, because when we put out the RFI, we talked, specifically on input that we were hoping to get related to how to build the framework through mechanisms. How do we better communicate? Because that's a big piece of the NNI, both, we'll tackle that. And then also some of the key topics, just so you know where I'm headed with this. And then I'm going to come back and address some of the things that some of the threads that you've laid out in your opening comments, and I'm going to pull on those next. But with respect to commercialization, communication in particular, we as a community have developed mechanisms, including, nano.gov has been a resource for people around the world to look at nanotechnology resources. Things have evolved a great deal in the past 20 years, and I'm not sure websites are as productive as maybe they once were. We've started a podcast, but I think that yesterday during the discussion, there were some ideas put forward about how to better spread the word about successes, opportunities, to make connections. We also heard in responses to the RFI and in the discussions yesterday about how the meetings are important. Nano for Defense was one of the meetings that was discussed, and how bringing people together to bring the discussions across different communities together at the same time. And I think Jared's opening comments refer to that as well. How do we get industry and the people who deliver education together? So my question is, did any discussion or ideas emerge with respect to how do we, as an NNI, how do we improve communication about the successes, about the opportunities, and how do we best make the connections that are so critical in this area? And where do you go for information? And so those are kind of my big questions. And I'm going to go backwards this time. I'm going to start with Gretchen.
Great. So this wasn't an area that came up and that we discussed. There was ICON was brought up a number of times, how that was, people kind of missed it, and they thought that was done well. And there were some ideas that maybe it would be possible to use some of the public-private consortiums that are in existence that are really strong right now. For example, some of the advanced materials and advanced manufacturing consortiums, that we might be able to use those groups to disseminate communications and guidance related to nano.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I think in the area that you're representing, responsible development is one thing. We've really looked at how the body of knowledge that has been developed over the past 20 years, and how do we get that into the community so they don't recreate the same testing. So those are some great ideas. Thank you. So Jared, I mean, you mentioned this in your opening remarks. How do we improve communication between industry and educators and with researchers and with the public?
I think this is vital, and it's such an important endeavor that we need to be doing. I think one of the issues that I've seen is scientists, engineers, educators were some of the worst self-promoters out there. Like, I don't think that we do a very good job of promoting how awesome nanotechnology is. We make videos and we make stuff that we like as educators, and I could watch it and be like, oh wow, I love this. This is so awesome. But then I think on the terms of like, well, what does a student think, right? If a student goes and listens to a PhD scientist talk about his love for nano, but it's not in a format that the students are going to be engaged in, what's the likelihood that they're going to watch it? So I think that there's the how do we create video content or podcasts that students are really going to enjoy? And then there's the aspect of, well, how do we also communicate with each other and share industry and the educators' content so that we can see what each other does? I love the podcast idea, the NNI Stories podcast that Lisa does. I know in our group, we talked about TikTok nano challenges, getting students to just do some cool things on TikTok, using Instagram, using Snapchat, using a lot of these social media that's out there that, a lot of us, because we're not as experienced in doing it, we just don't know how to effectively use that platform in order to sort of sell what we're bringing. And I look at this in terms of students, especially. How do we get students aware of what nanotechnology is, what is available, and then get them to actually stay there and watch that video? And then once they see the video, they can be, sent to another site that'll give them more information about what it is. And then also, here's the opportunities that are available at the end. Here's where you go to actually sign up for a nanotechnology course or a nanotechnology program. And then here's the industry that you can connect with in order to show them where the jobs are. I know Mike Russo and SEMI has been doing a lot of this with their SemiWorks platform, developing sort of a portal that students and educators can combine and look at in industry and in a way promote nanotechnology education and opportunities to everybody within the U.S., kind of to grow this nanotechnology community.
Great, thank you. So Jennifer, communication from in the infrastructure area, I'm thinking, not only the raising awareness of the tools that are available, and making sure that researchers who are looking for these tools can more easily find them, but the opposite is true too. And I think going into the discussion or the points that you made earlier about sustainability, being able to also talk about the impact and the success of these user facilities so that they're recognized as being valuable part of the ecosystem. Did you all talk about communication in both directions? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm muted right now. Yes. Yeah. Great question. Thank you. First of all, I think in terms of just making known to the broader community, like what tools are available, and in some ways kind of improving the core user journey. We talked about one thing we're trying to do at Stanford with interconnecting facilities across like all of the schools is, creating just kind of a virtual front door. Like even if you don't have one physical space, like just having kind of a searchable platform where if a new user comes in and wants to use like, a GC or a mass spectrometer, like they can search that and then see like all the different mass specs and the capabilities. So, having kind of a virtual like searchable platform across, the NNCIs or like the DOE centers that can tell people where facilities are might be really useful. But then you're right, like we really need to kind of communicate what sort of breakthrough, science this critical infrastructure can enable. And I think, Landon mentioned something great with like the podcast. Those are really good, YouTube videos. I feel like at least a lot of the students who, I'll teach in classes, like they're learning so much through YouTube, like, just watching, whether it's, online courses or, even just like basic, music theory, right? Like there's so much you can get out there from a popular YouTube channel that, figuring out how to convey like our science to the broader public, I think can, get people fired up again about nanoscience and teach them about like how critical these technologies are. And some people in our panel talked about, just going and speaking to policymakers and coming with, widgets that they had made in our lab that, don't need a microscope or a magnifying glass to look at, but, some cool like, 3D printed, but still nanostructured architectures that say are extremely, light, but also like tough and durable. So, going with kind of actual artifacts that we can show, the public is really important. The final comment I'll make is just on, in part related to communication, but also in part related to mechanisms that someone in our discussion brought up, which is the funding system for like transportation infrastructure. Like we don't often think about the importance of roads, and yet we use them, for, car transport, for shipping, for, commuting. And that's kind of well established and accepted by the community, but, maybe less so for like the nano community. When we think about critical infrastructure, there's not really this sustainable funding model that we have for, say other critical infrastructure like roads. So maybe there's something we can learn from it. And I thought that was like a really interesting analogy that someone in our breakout session brought up.
Well, that's great. And I think that that's great. I'll pick that up in maybe some of the other discussion points. I want to move to Landon and with respect to communication with industry. I think that we've and this was something that we talked a little bit during the breakout session, is that I think there has been much more commercialization of nanotechnology than many people believe, because that is not communicated well, whether industry, the hype over nanomaterials in the early days has kind of, the nano part of it isn't important. It's really the attributes that are important, and companies don't, promote that. Whether, the issue is surrounding, the government doesn't like to pick favorites and showcase results because that may be perceived poorly. So that's a piece of it. Like, how do we better communicate nano successes and where it is being used? But I would also love your thoughts and your feedback on the discussion regarding how does the government better communicate with industry, and this could be with respect to funding announcements, requirements, or also with respect to regulation, which I know is another point that was discussed. Can you share kind of where the discussion went?
Yeah, I mean, so from my perspective, one of the challenges, and this is a common theme, I think, whenever you talk to people about navigating government, is understanding where the opportunities are, what they are, what the requirements are, is a challenge. And it's just, let's face it, it's because of the size of government and how big it is and how bureaucratic it can be at times. Anything that NNI and NCO can do to aggregate this information in one place, perhaps into focus areas that are commercially relevant, I think would be a tremendous help. So, I'm not speaking just for the commercial world at this point, but, if there are research opportunities that intersect with nano, perhaps that's something that would be highly relevant to universities. Workforce issues, highly relevant to, a maker of nanomaterials like ourselves. Funding opportunities, same thing. So I think the aggregation of this information into a centralized location, and then also continuing to continually pump out content so that the audience stays engaged is critically important. The other thing that I would, and we didn't discuss this in the group, this is me layering a degree of my own bias here, is the number of constituents that have to be reached and touched in order to do that effectively is many, and they cross-cut different areas, different focuses, different needs, desires, and wants, and different aspirations. And so it does beg the question, is that something that the NNI wants to be doing, really going out and touching every far corner of the nano universe, or whether, again, my bias, that a nano trade association step into that role to start building and fostering the ecosystem, which allows NNI to plug in directly and access that audience, and at the same time that association can advance other advocacy goals that obviously inside government can't do.
Great, thank you. So Kristen, to you, I think looking at the R&D ecosystem is quite broad, and being able to communicate again in both directions is challenging. Is this something that was discussed in your group?
Sure. Yeah, I asked the question whether the community or the breakout participants missed the conferences, given that we're now in a virtual environment. And there was sort of a yes and a no. And they also thought that there was a good thing that we are learning how to use our online tools much more effectively. I think this has been said before, but I think that going forward, conferences and that mode of communication should embrace the hybrid model. I don't miss sitting in the back of a Marriott room, not being able to see the projector or hear the person who's talking up front. Whereas now I can actually see exactly what's on the slides. I can talk to people with very little disturbances. So there are things we can learn and make that communication more efficient. That being said, it was also highlighted that person-to-person recommendations networking is indeed one of the most useful ways of communicating where to go. Right? I asked the question, where do you go when you need a certain amount of expertise, or you need to reach out to academia or reach out to industry in the other direction? And they almost invariably say, yeah, I go and talk to my buddy who refers me to another buddy who sends me to a third buddy, and eventually I find the person, or I don't, and I give up, right? How do we facilitate that? Well, there is the whole social media, right? And I think we could leverage that better. There are perils and pitfalls of social media, but used responsibly, it's a good idea. So I just retweeted the NNI announcement that we were all having this moderate discussion. I'm going to apologize beforehand because I have to Google some of you guys' Twitter handles. But we all have networks, right? So we could be using those better. When we actually do want to communicate something, I just send this at the Dion group and at the Sirion Nano, and just saying, great discussion. I think we could be using those more effectively. Our students for sure are. They're very good at this. And if we use those platforms more in a responsible and fair way, then I think they'll be good. We also, this last thing, we mentioned the use, and I think that's been said also, the need for translators, like people who can communicate effectively between the areas.
Yep, and that's a point I want to come back to, because I think that came up in several groups. But before I do, I want to hit the third kind of big theme we laid out originally, which is the topics. So I think earlier I heard quantum mentioned. I'm not sure what other topics have been mentioned, but I'm gonna stop again. I'm gonna start again at the top and go to Kristen with respect to, if the NNI, relaunches with, concepts of grand challenges or signature initiatives or some other mechanism of supporting topical activities, what are the topics, the R&D topics that the NNI really has to be sure to address?
So we didn't exactly get into the specific topics, but what was highlighted over and over again in my session was the fact that there needs to be a strong communication between industry and academia. So I would suggest to listen to those folks. I mean, quantum information science was listed as one of the emerging, and where people also mentioned that it's important that, again, connecting to education, that students have a fundamental understanding of quantum mechanics, which isn't always part of their class curriculum coming out of engineering if you're not a PhD student. So I think that I'm going to punt to the top specific topics.
That's okay. It's a hard
forward discussion. Well, I also don't want to miss anything, right? I think this is a really important question to ask, but I don't want to miss anything that's really important. And yeah, I think my participants should have the weigh in on that one.
I'm gonna skip around a little bit. Gretchen, I know you have to step out. I don't know if you want to make a quick comment before you have to step out.
Sure. Oh, related to topics?
Correct.
So again, I feel like I mentioned this at the beginning. There was a lot of discussion about ethics and making sure that that's coming in at the beginning. And safer by design, safer by design materials, that certainly came up, and that terminology was used quite a bit. So I feel like those two things, making sure that at the beginning of new technology development, that people are understanding kind of the safety considerations before something is launched and is available.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, so you mentioned, I think you made reference to quantum. You mentioned the pandemic response and the importance of that. Were there any other specific topics that were discussed in your session?
And those were kind of two of the main topics. Another one that came up is kind of just new nanosystems for computing and information. Another topic that came up actually was characterization. Someone in our session mentioned how there's kind of been a shift in a lot of nano centers at different universities to have more characterization tools than fabrication tools. And I think characterization is really where you see this convergence of disciplines, kind of regardless of whether you're working on problems in sustainability or in health or in engineering, you're always going to need, usually high-end characterization tools to be able to see what your widget looks like. And in terms of topics, you, I think, or Stacy actually put in the comments, someone for the audience about, how a lot of fabrication has taken, almost more of a top-down approach. And yet we're seeing in a lot of cases, for example, in health and in catalysis and in quantum, that we really need this atomic scale, precision, or basically the, atomic scale, structure and composition plays a huge role in, quantum system performance or in catalyst and photocatalyst performance. And, we're finally at a point where I think we have theoretical models that can help us predict how these, atomic scale structures will actually perform, in systems or in devices. And yet, we need to have maybe the, the pivot to, either fabrication or synthesis platforms that enable more atomic scale precision. And I think we're getting there in some cases, but we need more of it. And then also more, advanced characterization equipment that, does exist, but it's sometimes hard for, universities to invest in that can, correlate that atomic scale structure with performance.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Jared, did any topics in particular come up in your session?
No, so I don't think that we mentioned a whole lot about topics, but I do think one aspect of, at least education-wise, is how do we make sure that we show all of the different aspects of nanotechnology? In the past, I think that, at least from a community college standpoint, we focused a lot on microelectromechanical systems, semiconductor industry, fabrication. And sometimes we don't focus on like the nanobiotechnology or photonics or material science, manufacturing, and especially for students, and I really focus on those first 2 years, whether you're at an undergraduate institution or a community college. How do we show those students the different aspects of nanotechnology within all of the different disciplines, physics, chemistry, biology? One, I think that's a great way to get students more interested in it. Just you can show how multidisciplinary it is. Two, for me as an educator, it's more interesting because now I get to teach all different aspects of different sciences. But also it opens the way to students could then kind of choose, oh, you know, I really enjoy this, making nanobioconjugates for medicine, or, oh, I really making fabrication, making computer chips, you know, the electronic aspect of it. Providing avenues that have different topics, different disciplines early in a student's education, kind of at least showing them what's possible and the different paths that they can take could only benefit the students and make all of us sort of work together, you know, have the semiconductor people talk to the biology people, because, you know, DNA on a chip has components of biology and it has components of semiconductor stuff. I think that just makes it more interesting, and we progress farther as a community.
Great. Thank you, Jared. So Landon, in the commercialization session, were there any specific topics that kind of boiled up as important areas for the NNI to focus on?
So one area that I think would dovetail perfectly into this was a discussion around regulatory and regulators, and having a kind of much more clear understanding of, let's say, for example, EPA requirements, OSHA requirements, kind of debugging and demystifying some of the process that these regulators require. I think that's a brilliant role that the NNI can play, especially because it's inside government and you can communicate the needs of the industry. I do, of course, NNI to an extent, I think at least can vocalize inside the community the level of the playing field between different countries and their policies with respect to investment in nano. You know, and I've mentioned this in many talks before, but, you know, the direct injection of capital into companies in Russia and China by the government, or quasi-injection via grant mechanisms in the EU. How does the U.S. level the playing field there? I won't prescribe a solution, but I think that that's something that the NNI can both study and advocate for inside.
Great. Thank you, Landon. So I'm going to now just maybe throw out some topics and have anybody who's interested jump in, and we're also getting a good stream of comments from the viewers now as well. But one of the things that has come up a few times now, and I know it was mentioned in the session that I attended as well, and that is the concept of requiring translators. And I think that, I think professionally, where I've always sat was at the bridge of industry, academia, government, in a lot of the activities I did. And, you know, I feel like there's a real value in having somebody who can, you know, we talked very early in the early days of the NNI. This was really focused a lot on translating between disciplines, coming up with some common language. That interdisciplinarity was a real challenge. But I think the concept of translation, as I heard it come up today, was not necessarily across disciplines, but across, you know, sectors, across different stages in the technology development pathway. So I open it up for people's thoughts on on kind of maybe this is the challenge, but then also maybe to challenge you to this is how maybe we can address it. Because I do think that at the NNCO, we do play a role in trying to bring people together. So how do we best translate, or are there other entities or mechanisms we need to develop? So looking for maybe problem statement and some ideas for solutions.
I can speak to this from a company perspective, and we did talk about this in the commercialization session quite a bit, or it seemed to keep coming back. So in order for an organization like ours, who is focused on design, scale up, manufacturing of nanomaterials, it really requires a broad degree of competencies, and they all have different languages. And so how do you create a common language between departments so that you can effectively communicate needs, wants, desires, and kind of next steps? And I can't prescribe necessarily a solution here. I can tell you what we did, which is we had to work very hard to build a common language. And we did that really from more of a project management perspective, understanding phases and gates, very well-defined steps in a process to go from research to scale up, or really debug to scale up to manufacturing, and also plugging into this all of the business needs and the regulatory needs and the legal needs as well. Because it's not just enough to invent, you also have to make sure, as we had discussed in our session, is your supply chain robust? Are your feedstock materials actually commercially available and cost effective? When you're at scale up, was something done in research that is going to create problems in scale up later? Being able to address these things through common language and common understanding of expectations really is the key. The only thing that I have found that has worked is really investing time and energy to build that institutional knowledge. And that's what we have done.
Great. Other thoughts on this topic?
Yeah. Go for it, Jared.
Oh, sorry. I love how Landon talked about developing stuff at the industry and getting the common language. I think this is a role that an organization like ours, the Micro Nanotechnology Education Center, could really play a big component in, is talking to different industries and making those connections with the educators at community colleges and four-year universities, and kind of asking, well, what is the language that we need to be teaching students so that when they get to industry, they're at least aware of kind of how to speak the nanotechnology language. I think it is really important to get that started as soon as possible. It'd be really helpful even for us to talk with industry and as community college educators who aren't necessarily divested 100% of the time, in fact, probably not even 10% of the time in micro nanotechnology, because our focus is teaching our subjects like chemistry for me. Having industry talking to us and, here's how we say this, here's how we talk, and being really involved. And that's what the BUILT model is, getting actively engaged and telling us that this is what we need you to get those students to know and how to speak so that they're ready once they get to our companies, so that they can be more efficient and productive right off the bat, instead of, oh man, I've got to spend a year making them know just what they're talking about.
Yeah, I very much agree with what both Landon and Jared said, and kind of adding on to that. When I mentioned translation, and in part I was thinking about how we, translate research, out of the lab and into the, commercial domain, but it is also largely translation, from one discipline to the next, because I think there's a lot we can learn by, convergence of different fields. And I'll just give, one example in electron microscopy. I think there have been amazing advances in, electron microscopy and characterization. And this is an area that, is critical not only for, say material scientists or chemical engineers who are, doing a lot of kind of atomic scale, characterization and then also spectroscopy, but of course also critical for, biomedical researchers who are trying to image protein structure. And then the amount of data that you can generate on an electron microscope is, probably terabytes in any one particular experiment. So you really need data scientists who can help you to, analyze like these 4D diffraction patterns or, scanning transmission electron micrograph data sets that you're getting. So I think that's, just one example area where you really have convergence of historically different disciplines. And yet when you bring these people together into one community, they can benefit so much from each other. Like the, bio-cryo-EM community can learn about the spectroscopic techniques from the materials community, and the materials community can learn about, cryo-EM for, say, energy materials. And then, the data scientists can, teach, new like AI and ML algorithms to, analyze data sets and more efficiently kind of extract the data. So I think you mentioned, I guess, Lisa, translation between disciplines. And this is an area that I think is actually quite critically needed for, physical and cyber infrastructure. If we really want to think about updating our infrastructure, in the most impactful ways, thinking about how people from different departments and different disciplines, have converging needs, I think will enable like, the most, kind of broadly usable but also impactful infrastructure, if we can design tools that, are almost, I don't want to say like, plastic, but easily reconfigured, right? You have a tool that has, a number of different configurations that can meet the needs of these communities.
Great. And Kristen, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I resonate with the need to have translators or to embed people from different disciplines into the same team to solve a problem. We discussed the need for improved data handling, harnessing the data in nanotechnology and generally in science in a better and more coherent way than we're doing it currently. We all have data management plans that we write for the federal grants we're doing, but are we really following up, or are we using best practices? And then most importantly, do these data resources, once we create them, do they talk to each other? So and this is not easy, as you know, when you ever try to fix something on your computer or you're trying to do something and you talk to somebody from IT, it takes a while before you speak the same language. So this is clearly two domains which are quite disparate. And in my experience, the best thing you can do is getting some from the domain sciences to have a little bit of knowledge in the IT world or the data science world and get them to sort of become your translator, in both directions. That has worked really well for me, but I do think that we need to pay close attention to it. Otherwise, we're all going to run off and make different solutions in different places, and we'll waste money and resources not using each other's language, using each other's knowledge in the most efficient way.
So I want to just maybe dig in a little bit. I want to come back to the data question that you brought in, but so there were some ideas, or at least some needs identified for translating across different groups. I guess my maybe more direct question is, so how can the NNI structure the framework or do something different than it has in the past 20 years to facilitate this, bringing together of different people, as you mentioned, and that's been done in the R&D world with centers and multidisciplinary, programs, some of the networks. But how? So, does anyone have ideas on how we can either serve as a translator across communities or bring them together to promote these conversations so that a common language is developed, or there isn't this disconnect?
Well, if I just may give a suggestion, the best way to teach, in my opinion, an multidisciplinary topic is to show an example. So if you show an example of, for example, what Jennifer was talking about, like if you're going to analyze electron microscopy results with the data, how does one do that? and not using domain-specific names as much as possible, right? And showing what is the impact if you do this right. Then people get very excited. It's like, oh, can I do that too? Is there a template? Is it something that, you know, we can leverage for other resources? So I do think that example is the best way to teach this, because if it's just very theoretical, especially if it's in a domain you don't understand, it's hard to grasp. Sorry, somebody else was talking to.
Yeah, I jumped in over the top of you. I'm sorry about that, Kristen. I look at it and I just say to myself, it's an incredibly complicated task. And so again, I'm not prescribing solutions here, but to the extent that NNI can aggregate up, for example, the community of federal researchers that are looking at basic science, you know, the people that are focused on characterization, and similarly, industry, you know, one big bucket of industry, and then bring them together for relevant topics that are cross-cutting. I think you can start to get some connectivity there. This would not be my strong suit, but you know, I really do see NNI as like a hub and spoke model. You know, NNI the hub and the focus areas being the spokes.
I think it's really, and I see the question from Mia about, you know, translating inventions of entrepreneur sources from business to the nanotech, you know, so how is their nanotechnology talking, but also how is the business talking aspect of it? And I think a really good example of at least a community college-based one is the American Association for Community College Innovation Challenge. Having programs like that where you're forming teams of students working with faculty mentors to develop a product, or, you know, or a research idea that then they submit to the AACC sort of in a competition. And then if the students or the teams that win the awards then go and they participate in an entrepreneurial workshop in DC where they actually get to meet researchers, meet industry leaders, and then they're talking directly to students. One, you're getting the students and mentors and faculty people actively engaged in thinking about how to talk science and talk business. But then you're also having government organizations sort of oversee it and help facilitate it so that, you know, the students and faculty are getting trained in how to talk that way. Because I know as a community college faculty member, I'm listening to this conversation going like, yeah, I don't know 100% how to talk to industry people as a community college nanotech instructor. So having this and figuring it out would be a very beneficial endeavor.
Great, thank you. So I want to come back to the concept of data. I know it came up a few times in the respective discussions, and it's certainly an area of very active discussion in the interagency group as well. But Kristen, I think you brought it up most recently, so I'm going to turn to you. You know, what could you frame what the discussion was about and maybe some ideas that were generated?
In what
with respect to data?
Oh, well, I think we're all recognizing that there is a real need to harness the data from various, especially user facilities. And I suppose one of the things that was mentioned was the need for understanding when can we release the data, and can we release it in a more sort of controlled way that we're doing right now. Now it's on every sort of single investigator to figure this out for themselves within whatever grant they're given. They write a management plan, they put it on their own hard drive, maybe they put a link in the paper. It's not particularly coherent. It's not, they don't talk to each other. There's no, so, and every time I bring this up for the user facility, and now I'm directing one, I'm given the sort of pushback that, well, we don't know who owns the data. The user who comes with a sample and takes a measurement on the DOE instrumentation, they own the sample. We can't do anything with that data until they release it. So having an agreement up front, at least a voluntary one, where, you know, 2 years from now, unless you absolutely say no, can we release the data within our streamlined portals? And getting some agreement and community buy-in for that kind of data, I think that is a real something that NNI could be part of. How do we get the community? Kind of like the protein data bank, when that got started, that was a community-driven effort. It was not top-down. So how do we get people on board with sharing the data in a more sort of automated or streamlined fashion than today, sort of ad hoc, whatever you wrote in your proposal? And funding maybe some centralized data storage and harness, like curating and storing and disseminating data takes effort and money, recognizing that. And at least starting from the voluntary. I'm not saying that everybody has to do this. If you come with your sample and you want to sit on that, data that you took for that sample for 10 years, then maybe that should be your prerogative as long as you're following the rules otherwise. But I think a lot of people would be passionate about sharing their data to getting more exposure to their research. So figuring that out from a community perspective, I think would be really a good thing to do.
Yeah, I'll, piggyback off of what Kristen was saying. And I think, not only in having a database, but also in creating kind of like a shared instrumentation, IoT, where, infrastructure is interconnected by virtue of having, like a kind of software platform that kind of better connects tools and also provides data for new users to come in and more quickly optimize their process. So for example, they have kind of a new material or a new, set of parameters that they're trying to explore and optimizing, say, a fabrication process. If there was, publicly available data that people had, voluntarily released to say, like, hey, when I tried these processing parameters, I got this set of results. Then when you have a new process, you can more kind of quickly optimize, on that rather than reinventing the wheel each time you're trying to pattern a new device or a new system. So I think, not only data for, extracting interesting trends, but also in enhancing kind of the research and development pipeline and speed by allowing users to more quickly optimize their process could be really impactful.
Yeah, maybe can I just say one comment about that? That's really important that we share data, not just about successes, which tends to go into papers, but also failed experiments. We're not learning more than word of mouth right now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just layer on what we discussed in our group. It was a theoretical materials database, and the whole thinking behind this, and everybody in industry should be familiar with it. When an engineer is working with different materials, trying to get some kind of performance out of it, usually there are references and guides that they can go to look at materials, its characteristics, its performance, so that it can kind of narrow its bets when working with the materials during prototyping. What we see from our customers today is that they come in to, let's say, a scientific hunch. I want to get X performance. I think these 5 potential materials could get the job done. And they do that because there is lack of really any information except for what they can find out in the literature, which is sometimes sparse. I think it would be very, very interesting to have a materials database where not only do you highlight physical characteristics of let's say, a company's particular material, but also how it performed in a suite of either lab tests or quasi real world tests, because it would give people who want to work with nanomaterials, who believe nanomaterials could provide a performance benefit, some real hunch to go on. And in other industries like steel, they have these things. You can pull a book off the shelf and look it right up. The other thing I would say is this is a role for government. You are not going to get industry to do something like this. A lot of the data sharing that we're talking about, both successes and failures, I don't see how anybody can really coordinate and push something like this and also fund the investment than government. I don't think you'll see universities do it. I don't think you'll see industry do it.
Jared, do you have any thoughts on the data issues? Is that something that was discussed?
We didn't talk about the data issues. And I won't lie, as a community college educator and a nanotech person, I'm not as familiar with, the data issues and about sharing it and stuff like that. So I'm going to kind of pass on that one.
Okay, fair enough. So we have only about 5 minutes left, and I think I've hit most of the high points that I wanted to address. I would like to maybe open it up for some kind of just general thoughts that you might have that you want to share, either that came from the discussions in your breakouts or based on the conversation we've had here, or other things that you think will inform the discussion for the future of the NNI. And I'll pass it to anyone who wants to take the.
I can start. And again, thanks for including, a community college instructor and the Micro Nanotechnology Education Center in this. I think the one comment that I would have that I hope that we can have more discussion on is how do we increase diversity of nanotechnology technicians, nanotechnology researchers, nanotechnology leadership in industries. As a community college professor, almost all the colleges that we work with are minority serving institutions, and coming up with strategies that we can increase participation of underrepresented students and faculty in our community is one avenue that I would love the NNI to work with us and talk about and kind of figure out what can we do to be more inclusive as a community.
Thanks for that challenge. I think I look forward to working with you on that.
Yeah, I would jump in here and just say, a parting thought, and we did discuss this, not significantly, but it did get covered around workforce-related issues. And, Jared, I am surprised that you're not getting engagement from industry as it relates to kind of what industry needs, only because Sirion really recognizes that there are some fairly significant issues coming down the pipeline over time. So, anything that we can do to enhance workforce development, I can give everyone here some examples. For example, lab technicians. Extremely hard to come by. And when I say come by, you can find them, but then they're gone just as quick. And we pay above market, generally speaking. There is a need. We can source fantastic research scientists from all across the United States. It is very difficult to locate people that are interested and or have chemical engineering degrees with a focus on advanced materials or nanomaterials. And we have had to take some pretty drastic actions in-house to start building farm teams in that regard, because we don't see it coming out of the education system. Of course, there's regular chemical engineering, just not with nano focus. So I would say that is a really good role for NNI to undertake and to work with the community to start identifying what those needs are. And then, of course, this translational language thing as well, I think is a great role for NNI. Industry should be interested in participating. Sirion is certainly interested in participating because it lubricates the entire pathway from research all the way through to commercialization. And that's the only way you make money, is if you get it out the door and into an end user's hands.
Maybe I'll say something on behalf of the nanocenters. I know that the Molecular Foundry does outreach, and we try to fund the undergraduate fellowships to come and work we have 7 different facilities, from nanofabrication to organic synthesis to inorganic synthesis. And we love having community college students as well as other students come and work in our lab as part of their education. So that's something I can advertise as available. And we've noticed that even though we've been around for 10 years and a bit, not everybody in the country is aware of the nanocenters and all the things that are available there. So again, sort of, please spread the word. We want to be a community resource.
Great. And
yeah, and I'll just end by saying, I resonate with the comments, especially on, diversity. I think to enable the next big breakthroughs in, information science, in sustainability and health, we really need, diversity of thought, of perspective, of backgrounds. We need to, teach, people and the public that science can really, bring good to the planet and, kind of develop ways to maybe build more faith or restore faith, so to speak, in the scientific discipline. And I think the next big breakthrough really comes from, convergence of different disciplines and different perspectives. So yeah, I'll just echo what I think it was either Jared or Landon mentioned about, diversity broadly defined and, how we can work together as an institute to increase diversity and also enable convergence, of disciplines and perspectives in nanoscience.
Great. Well,